Before long, I was peeling off the compulsory wear school tie that made us easily identifiable in the streets of the town, and joining undergraduates at lectures in the history faculty. I heard Herbert Butterfield of Peterhouse, a famous Methodist and critic of the Whig interpretation of history, talk on Machiavelli. I went to Walter Ullman's inaugural lecture on theocratic states. It became possible in a town with many jovially blind-eyed landlords to join people for drinks and disputation in pubs afterward. While I was a little more than a schoolboy, I was more than ready to be the relatively new thing, a student. Other noises, coming from just off the tiny stage of school, had begun to reach me, sometimes by transistor radio. At the Poetry Society one evening, a boy named Mainwaring interrupted our sedate discussion to urge forward a new name that I first registered mentally as Bob Dylan. I was fairly soon hooked on what Philip Larkin called Dylan's cawing, derisive voice, and felt almost personally addressed by the words of Masters of War and Hard Rain, which seemed to encapsulate the way in which I had felt about Cuba. Then there were the loving and less cawing strains of Mr. Tambourine Man. She Belongs to Me and Baby Blue. I've since had all kinds of differences with Professor Christopher Ricks, but he is and always has been correct in maintaining that Dylan is one of the essential poets of our time, and it felt right to meet him in the company of Shelley and Milton and Lowell, and not in one of the record shops that were then beginning to sprout alongside the town coffee bars. A more exotic name was also being wafted through the ether and into my head, the name Vietnam. This did not come freighted with fear like the word Cuba. It arrived rather as a summary and combination of everything one had ever learned, from Goya to Wilfred Owen, about the horrors of war. There was something profoundly, horribly shocking in the odds and the proportions of the thing. To all appearances, it seemed as if a military-industrial superpower was employing a terrifying aerial bombardment of steel and explosives and chemicals to subdue a defiant agrarian society. I had expected the newly elected Labour government to withhold British support for this foul war and the amazingly coarse and thuggish-looking American president who was prosecuting it. And when this expectation was disappointed, I began, along with many of my contemporaries, to experience a furious disillusionment with conventional politics. A bit young to be so cynical and so superior, you may think. My reply is that you should fucking well have been there and felt it for yourself. Had the study of life and literature and history merely domesticated me to waste and betray my youth, and to gape at a spectacle of undisguised atrocity and aggression as if it should be calmly received. I hope to never lose the access to outrage that I felt then. At Easter 1966, my brother and I joined the annual march of Britain's Stage Army of the Good, the yearly pilgrimage of pacifists and anarchists and ragtag Reds that tramped from the nuclear weapons factory at Aldermaston to the traditional center of radical protest in Trafalgar Square. I donned the universal symbol of peace and wore in my lapel its broken cross or imploring outstretched arm logo. I also read Bertrand Russell's appeal to forget about the insipid slogan of peace and take the side of the fighting Viet Cong. I began to take part in the hot arguments that were latent in the two positions. Singing to the Trafalgar Square crowd, along with various folk moaners like Julie Felix, was the dynamic, sexy Paul Jones of Manfred Mann. Patrolling the fringes of the demonstration were blue uniformed figures whom I had been brought up to view as friends and protectors. The first real kick he gets from a cop is often a huge moment of truth to a young member of the middle class. One should not postpone the raising of a curtain. In my own case, the revelation of a curtain up was more of a sudden vivid peek from the wings, but no less memorable for that. I was back at boarding school, and gritting my teeth to do well in my exams so that I might shed the schoolboy carapace and pupate as a full-fledged student. at Balliol. It must have been the late summer of 1966, and probably toward the end of term, because otherwise the headmaster wouldn't have given permission for our very own homegrown school pop group, harmlessly enough named the Saints, to give a concert on the cricket field. It was one of those warm and still evenings that in ancient Cambridge stay in the memory for a long time. Boys and masters sat or stood as they would have done for a cricket match, the more senior in comfy seats in the pavilion, and others on benches, the rest on grass. After taking us through a fairly tame Buddy Holly-style repertoire, the respectable Saints switched to a passably potent and twanging version of House of the Rising Sun. The amplifiers must have been good, and as I said, the night was soft and still. At any rate, the sound must have carried because, very suddenly and very quickly, the cricket ground of our exclusive private school was overrun by a huge crowd of boys and even girls from the town. They had heard the strains of rock, even of mild rock, and they knew about Eric Burdon and the Animals, and they also knew by now that there was nothing much their parents or the police could do about it, or about them. They crossed a social and geographic boundary that they had never transgressed before, and suddenly found it to be delightfully easy. Nonetheless, they were civil and quiet and curious, which meant that even my most awful contemporaries were embarrassingly polite and broad-minded in return, as well as nervously aware of being surpassed and outnumbered. There was even some mild fraternization before the school authorities saw the way things might go and pulled the plugs that had animated the drums and guitars. Then, but too late, the traditional police constables made their appearance. As one who had already been employing the town against the school for all kinds of private and public purposes, I was still rather slow to see what had just happened to Old Britain in front of my very eyes. The first thought I had was derived from my traditional and classical half. Surely this was like those other animals of the forest who had been shyly drawn to sit, forgetting their own wildness, when Orpheus began to pluck his lute. It was quite some while later that I thought, no, you sentimental fool, what you were seeing and hearing was the opening of the 60s.